Alright everyone, welcome back to the Neoclassical Perspective. In this second video, we'll be talking about some of the implications, especially the policy implications, of the neoclassical view, of the neoclassical theory. Now, as I mentioned in the previous video, one of the issues and one of the actual big dividing lines between neoclassical and Keynesian is how long do you think we have to wait before long-run, long-term effects start kicking in? The Keynesians will agree that long-run effects, will happen eventually. There is such a thing as the long run, but as Keynes said, in the long run, we're all dead. In other words, it might be a long time before we get to that long run. Such a long time that some of us will be dead of old age by then. That's an exaggeration, of course, but thinking of the long run as taking from 5 to 10 years is definitely well within the realms of standard Keynesian analysis. Whereas the neoclassicals will say no, the long run will kick in definitely after 2 years, possibly, maybe even sooner, but definitely 2 to 3 years. Therefore, we should focus on the long run because we don't have that long to wait. So the long run is the part that really matters. That is what the neoclassicals will say. They'll also say something else. In response to somebody who might object, okay, fine, the long run is going to kick in 2 to 3 years, let's say. Prices are going to be flexible in that time span. They're going to adjust. All right. Nevertheless, someone might ask, why are you neoclassicals opposed to Keynesian policy? After all, even if you think that it's not going to make much of a difference because the economy will, if we're in a recession, the economy will adjust back to potential GDP by itself in the long run anyway. In the long run, we don't have that long to wait for it, even if you think that. Nevertheless, surely Keynesian policy can help us get out of a recession faster. Even if you think it's going to end in a year or two, or 2 to 3 years, regardless, why not make it end in 6 months? We're using Keynesian policy. We can still do that, right? And in response to this, neoclassicals would say, yes, technically we can do that. Keynesian policy can make the recession end faster. But, we'll say the neoclassicals, because we expect that the long run isn't that long and the recession isn't going to be that long anyway, and the economy will bounce back, within a year, 2 years, maybe 3. Therefore, by the time you've actually enacted your Keynesian policy, it will be too late. It will be too late to get out of the recession faster. We will already be recovering. So neoclassicals don't deny that Keynesian policy can help get us out of a recession. They agree with that, but they argue that in practice, it is difficult to enact Keynesian policy or any kind of policy fast enough before the long run already kicks in and we're already recovering and it's no longer needed. The policy is no longer needed. According to the neoclassical perspective, while government policy can help, usually we can't get it done fast enough, and by the time we can get it done, it's no longer needed. We're already out of a recession or on our way out, so it's pointless. And the textbook mentions some of the reasons why it can take some time for government policy to be enacted. First of all, we have to know that we're in a recession in the first place, which, it depends. Sometimes we know faster, sometimes it takes a while to figure it out. And then after we know that there's a recession, that there's a problem, the government has to decide to act and has to enact laws to change fiscal policy or monetary policy to get us out of a recession. And that can certainly take months. It can take even upwards of a year or more, depending on the situation, depending on the political situation. And if it takes too long for policy to be implemented, and according to neoclassicals, even a year or two might be too long, 3 years is definitely, way too long, then by that point, the problem's already fixed itself, so what's the use of policy? That is what neoclassicals would say. So neoclassicals might agree with Keynesian policy to get us out of a recession if it could be done really fast. Like if we can respond to a recession extremely fast, then neoclassicals would say, yeah, okay, sure, you can do that, and that will shorten the recession. That's good. but they tend to be skeptical that we can get it done fast enough. Because again, they expect that the long run will be here relatively quickly. We don't have that long to wait before the economy bounces back. So they tend to be skeptical of policy to help the economy to bounce back because they expect that it will happen by itself relatively soon. And in any case, the policy is probably not going to kick in before the natural bounce back happens. That is the neoclassical perspective on policy. Then there is the matter of the Phillips curve. Remember that from last week? The Phillips curve. That is the curve that shows a trade-off between unemployment and inflation. If you remember, it looks like this. It's a graph with the axes representing the inflation rate and the unemployment rate. Do not confuse this with aggregate supply and demand. It has different axes, okay? So there's the inflation rate and the unemployment rate, and there's this downward sloping curve that shows a trade-off between inflation and unemployment. In other words, government policy can put us anywhere along this curve. We can choose a point where we want to be, but if we move up on the curve, as it were, if we move in this direction, there's going to be less unemployment, but more inflation. If we move in the other direction, there's going to be less inflation, but more unemployment. So there's a trade-off between these two. That's what this curve is saying. So, for example, suppose we want lower unemployment. Then we can choose, through government policy, to move to a new point on the Phillips curve, from point 0 to point 1, where, as you can see, unemployment has gone down, but inflation, or the inflation rate, has gone up. That's it. That's the Phillips curve in the Keynesian perspective. Now, the neoclassical perspective says that, yes, you have this Phillips curve in the short run, but in the long run, there is a natural rate of unemployment, and the economy will always just bounce back to that no matter what you do to it because of that long run aggregate supply curve. Remember, the long run aggregate supply curve also gives you a long run unemployment rate, which is called the natural rate of unemployment. So in the neoclassical perspective, if we try to do something like this, reduce unemployment by increasing inflation, then what's going to happen is this. The economy will simply shift to a new Phillips curve, right? You had the old one, but now there's a new Phillips curve, such that unemployment that we try to lower is going to just bounce back to U0, which is the natural rate of unemployment. So unemployment is just going to bounce back to its natural rate, and inflation will stay higher. In other words, the increase in inflation is going to happen, and it will remain, but unemployment will just bounce back, and that's because of that vertical long-run aggregate supply curve. So in other words, the Phillips curve is a thing in neoclassical theory as well, but they argue that the Phillips curve shifts so as to return us to that natural rate of unemployment. This is the same long-run adjustment that happens with aggregate supply as well. It just here you see it with a different curve. In the short run, we can move anywhere we want on the Phillips curve, but in the long run, the Phillips curve will shift so as to return us to that natural rate of unemployment. That's the neoclassical view. So as you may have noticed from this argument about the shifting Phillips curve, from what I said a few minutes ago about how neoclassicals do agree that Keynesian policy can shorten a recession, but they don't think that it's terribly useful because they think that a recession is going to be short anyway, and so by the time you've enacted your policy, it's almost over, so what's the point? And from what I said in the previous video about how neoclassicals believe that the economy will always bounce back to that long-run aggregate supply curve no matter how aggregate demand might shift to the left or right, you may have noticed that the central theme in neoclassical theory is stability. The economy, according to the neoclassicals, is inherently stable. It will return to its stable state in response to anything that happens to it, if there's a problem with aggregate demand or if there's a government policy to move us along the Phillips curve or whatever, the economy will just bounce back, will return to where it wants to be. The natural rate of unemployment, long-run aggregate supply, that's where it's going to stay. So the theme in the neoclassical perspective is stability. The economy will return to its stable equilibrium no matter what you do to it. or no matter what any external factors do to it. Therefore, because they believe in stability and because they believe that stability is inevitable, they also tend to have a very pessimistic view of the ability of governments or anyone else to tinker with the economy, to change anything major about the economy. As I said in the second video last week, neoclassical economics tends to be associated with opposition to government intervention in the economy. But that's not entirely accurate. It will be more accurate to say that neoclassical economics is associated with the idea that government intervention just doesn't have much of an effect. At least it doesn't have much of an effect on the macroeconomy, on unemployment, or on recessions, on economic expansions. It does have an effect on inflation. That is the one area in which neoclassicals will agree that government policy can actually have a major and long-lasting effect on inflation. Because look, the inflation rate doesn't actually go back down when we have long-run adjustment. When we have the long-run adjustment, inflation stays high, for example, here with the Phillips curve. So neoclassicals do believe that governments can influence inflation or deflation, but not much else. So for this reason, it's not so much that they're opposed to government intervention in the economy, so much as they're opposed to changes in what governments do. Like I said in the second video last week, the neoclassical perspective tends to be that the government should just pick what it wants to do, high taxes or low taxes or in the middle, high intervention or low intervention or whatever. Just pick something that you want to do for other reasons that are not related to the macroeconomy, and then stick with it. Just stay there. Don't bother trying to fix recessions. Don't bother trying to increase or decrease taxes or increase or decrease spending in order to tweak unemployment. That's not going to work, or it's not going to have much of an effect, or it's only going to have a short-term effect. Don't worry about that. Just pick what you're going to do as a government for reasons that have nothing to do with the macroeconomy, and stick with that, and let the economy, at least the macroeconomy, in the long term, let it take care of itself. So for the most part, it would be most accurate to say that the neoclassical perspective of economics is that governments should decide what they want to do without regard for things like unemployment and recessions. Governments should decide what they want to do for other reasons. Maybe they believe that everybody deserves healthcare, or they don't believe that. Or maybe they want to expand the military, or they don't. For whatever other reasons, government should do what they're going to do and not worry so much about unemployment and recessions. That is the neoclassical perspective. However, the neoclassicals will admit that governments can impact inflation or deflation. And therefore, they do admit they do agree with one type of macroeconomic policy, and that is policy meant to limit inflation, to keep inflation low. Because they believe that is the one thing that government policy can do effectively, keep inflation low. So a neoclassical policy recommendation would be that governments, through monetary policy, we'll talk about monetary policy in a few weeks, through that, governments should try to keep inflation low, keep inflation under control, but don't worry so much about unemployment and recessions, because you can't do anything about them anyway, at least not in the long term, and it's not worth trying to do something in the short term. You're probably not going to be able to do it fast enough. That is the neoclassical perspective. And there's a nice useful table in the textbook on pages 328 and 329 that lists the differences between the neoclassical and the Keynesian perspectives. And of course, the second video from last week, also, in that video, I also talked a lot about the differences between the neoclassical and Keynesian perspectives, so I'm not going to repeat everything that I said then again, but maybe you should go back and watch that video, and that might be helpful because that applies to this week as well. The differences between these two different schools of thought, between these two different perspectives. One thing I will definitely say, however, is also the thing that the textbook ends the chapter with, which is that it is possible to take a middle ground view between neoclassical and Keynesian, and in fact, many economists do. So you shouldn't take everything that we've said, everything that the textbook and I have said about these two different perspectives, you shouldn't consider them to be like these two polar opposites that are at war with each other and have radically different views of the world and of the economy and of government policy and so on. I mean, they do have different views, but there's a spectrum between them, right? So economists can take a hardcore Keynesian view, or a hardcore neoclassical view, or a moderate Keynesian view, or a moderate neoclassical view, or something in between. And the in-between view is the very centrist, the very centrist view, the moderate view, basically says that neoclassicals are mostly correct about the long run, but Keynesians are mostly correct about the short run, and the long run doesn't come as quickly as neoclassicals think it will come, but it won't take as long as Keynesians think it will take either. So, we're not going to die of old age before the economy adjusts back to a long run aggregate supply, like Keynes might say. But the economy is also not going to adjust so fast that government policy is useless, like Milton Friedman might say. Prices aren't as sticky as Keynesians claim that they are, but they're also not quite as flexible as neoclassicals think that they are either. They're somewhere in between. And the same goes with wages, specific type of prices. That view exists. This sort of in-between view exists, and is quite popular. And so are the more pure neoclassical and Keynesian views. Those exist as well. There are debates between them. And of course, there are all the other schools of thought that we didn't talk about. Like I said, Marxian, Austrian, Sarafian, and others. And there are ways to combine those with Keynesian or neoclassical views as well. So you can actually get a really complicated mix of different ideas from different schools of thought. We're not going to go into that, but just so you know, that is a possibility. There is a spectrum of different views in economics about the macroeconomy, and of course about other topics too, but about the macroeconomy. And you can, and economists do, mix and match ideas from different schools of thought. They take middle ground positions on one issue, extreme positions on another issue. That can happen. And also this is very important, you shouldn't confuse the spectrum of views in economics with the spectrum of views in politics. I mentioned in the second video last week that, in the context of present-day American politics, the Keynesian school of economics tends to be associated with the left, and the neoclassical school tends to be associated with the right. But that's a very vague association. You can have the opposite. You can have a right-wing Keynesian or a left-wing neoclassical. And once you introduce those other schools that we haven't talked about, it gets even more complicated than that. Bear in mind that all of this about the macroeconomy doesn't really say anything about specific industries or specific kinds of government spending or specific kinds of taxes, which can make all the difference in politics between left and right. So, for example, let me give you just one very, very blatant example. When it comes to government spending and being for or against that government spending, consider the difference between government spending on healthcare and government spending on the military. Right? You could say that one is left-wing and one is right-wing. Government spending on healthcare versus the military. But as far as macroeconomic policy is concerned, they're both government spending, and it doesn't really matter which kind the government engages in from the perspective of economics, of macroeconomics. Well, of course, it matters a lot in politics, but not as far as economic theory is concerned. It doesn't matter if you're spending money on assistance for the poor, or healthcare for the elderly, or military spending, or a space program, or exploring the bottom of the sea. It's all government spending as far as economics is concerned. Not as far as politics is concerned. Those are very different kinds of government spending. Likewise with taxes. There's taxes on the rich, taxes on the poor, sales taxes, income taxes, property taxes, very different kinds of taxes. And in terms of taxes, economics will differentiate between them as well. We're not going to talk about those differences in this course because that's more of a fine-tuning, that's more of an advanced topic. So economics will differentiate between the different kinds of taxes, but only in their impact on total consumption. Which taxes will reduce consumption more than others. Whereas in politics, you would be more concerned with which taxes affect the poor, which taxes affect the rich, which taxes affect homeowners, which taxes affect, different kinds of people. You'd be more concerned in politics with the effect of taxes on different categories of people, whereas in economics, it's more like we're just concerned with the effect, the total impact of those taxes on the economy. So again, two different approaches to taxes. And so it goes with most other topics. There is, of course, a lot of overlap between politics and economics, but the sides, as it were, in economics, the schools of thought, don't match up perfectly, or sometimes don't match up at all, with the sides or the schools of thought in politics. Different political ideologies can be informed or based on or associated with different schools of thought in economics. A lot depends on context. So, having said that, this brings us to the end of the segment of the course where we talk about aggregate demand and aggregate supply and the way that that model is used by the two major mainstream schools of thought in economics, the Neoclassical and the Keynesian school. And so, next week we will head into a different topic, which is money, where it comes from, what it's for, how it impacts, how it's used in the macroeconomy, and so on. Until then, have a great week.